In chapter 2.5, we're going to look at another perspective of solving. Our rules don't change. That's why I told you that you wanted to make sure you understood everything up to 2.4. There may be a couple processes that you learned today, but first it's just important that we revisit a vocabulary term that we've probably not paid much attention to, and that word is solve. We've asked you to solve for x, we've asked you to solve for m, but what we've got to understand is that solve for x means get x alone, just like solve for e would mean get e alone. So if I was asked to solve for t, that would mean get t alone. So anytime you're asked to solve for something, the key thing you want to understand is that you want to get whatever that variable is by itself. That pattern goes for everything else in the instructions of the problem, so just keep that in mind as we go through today. If literal equations have multiple variables, what do I do with the extra variables? Literal equations are equations that do have x's, y's, z's, any kind of variables in them. They're not just one variable and a bunch of numbers, and so it can kind of intimidate some people. So what do you do with the extra variables? You simply ignore the ones that are unimportant and treat them like you would numbers. Let's look at some examples real quick to just give you an idea of what I mean by ignoring the other things and treating them like numbers. When we were asked to solve for x and it said x plus 3 equals 11, we knew that we simply subtracted the 3 because that was a positive 3. The 3's canceled out and we ended up with x equals 8. But in a situation where you'll see in a literal equation x plus y equals z, you want x by itself, so again that means x is important, which means that y is not. So what we're going to do is subtract y. But what comes down is, since we can't turn that into one term because you can't put them together, it's just z minus y. It's just that the answer is different. This is 11 minus 3, but it can be simplified. That is z minus y, which can't be simplified. This is what we're going to be doing today. When we saw 9x equals 45, we knew that we were supposed to divide by 9, divide by 9. The 9's canceled out, and 45 divided by 9 simplified to be 5. Same thing here. If I'm solving for x, that means I want x, I do not want y, which means I'm going to divide by y. The y's cancel out, and again, you cannot simplify that, and so your final answer is just z over y. That's all that happens. It's just that I can't go any further and make it a nice answer, so I just have to kind of leave it the way it was. Same thing here. X over 8 equals 11. We learned that when 8 was on the bottom, we simply multiply by that number to get rid of it. The 8's canceled out. 11 times 8 simplifies to be 88. But in this situation here, x over y equals z. Again, I want x by itself, so I get rid of y by multiplying by y. The y's cancel out. Just remember that you do want to alphabetize these things here if it's just one term, but there's different times when you'll do that. But yeah, x equals yz is what I would put there, and that's it. Notice again that our algebra skill does not change. We just have to learn to be comfortable with the weird types of answers that are going to be coming out. Once we get used to the weirdness, everything else will fall into place. The examples on the back of your notes are going to guide you through every type of question on your homework, your test, and your quiz. As you have seen, chapter 2.4, you've seen everything in terms of basic skills solving that you need, and so the rest of the things are just going to kind of take those ideas and expand them out in different directions and get you ready for your test. So on this week's quiz, what you're going to see is some of these, so just make sure you study this stuff and make sure you understand where everything is coming from. Solve for t. So 35 equals 9t minus 5u. First off, t is important because that's what I want alone. And so what I'm going to do is treat it like it was 9t minus some number. Remember, if it was 9t minus some number, the first thing I would do is get rid of that part right there. So the 5u needs to go first. This turns, because I can't do anything, into 35 minus 5u equals 9t. Again, the 5u went away. Now I divide both. Again, if I want t by itself, I divide both sides by 9. Getting 35 minus 5u over 9 equal to t. Now if you remember the distributive property where we separated our fraction, you could do that there, but it's not really always necessary unless you're taking a multiple choice test and the answer is split. But in this situation here, everything works out like it needs to. Again, notice again, this t was what I wanted, which means everything else is like a number, so we move the furthest thing from t first, and then we move the number right next to t second, and that was that. Another question is going to ask you to solve for y, but the trick here on this one when you see it is that we have two y's. in this case, we have to do something called factoring. Because both of these have a y, what we are going to do is use the factoring is just the opposite of distributive property, which means what we're going to do is take the y off and put the other two terms on the inside, which is a plus b, and that is equal to e. Notice again, you want to keep the capitals capital and the lowercase lowercase. But if you look at this, y times a is ay, y times b is by. So all we did, because both of these y's were here, was we factored it off by pulling off the y, leaving ourselves with a and b. Now that it's y times a plus b, you get rid of it by dividing by a plus b, which of course gets rid of that part, and you end up with e over a plus b as your answer there. Again, most of this stuff here is just going to be one of those where you've got to kind of get in there, experience it a little bit, and make sure you understand at least how the main steps go, and that way you're ready to at least try them out. But once you get far enough into literal equations, it's actually not that bad. It's just making sure you don't get intimidated again by the letters there. But I think these examples cover the majority of what you will see in anything else. It's just that they'll get a little bit longer with problems as you get older. Solve for k. Again, we want k by itself. If you remember the problem where we had the fraction and I said that you would add first, divide second, it means the first thing we want to do is get rid of the u. And so alphabetizing that, uw would equal k plus p. Again, the u's canceled out, moved over there. The second thing I would do is move the p by subtracting it, and so you end up with uw minus p is equal to k. And then the last type is just here to make sure you understand that, you know, there's some weird ones like this to where you have to do a little bit, not a little bit extra, but just to make sure you know your power. If I want to solve for t, notice that s and u are attached to t, but r is not, which means that r is the weakest one, so that's going to be the first thing we move. We end up with q minus r equals stu. But if I want t, you can divide by everything else, which means that you can put the s and the u on the bottom because it cancels out both of those. And again, putting s and u on the bottom there leaves us q minus r over su equals t. And again, that is literal equations. It's really a bad word in a lot of classes. You hear teachers talk about, or if you ask any teacher about how students feel about literal equations, they usually say everybody hates it. It's just because it's all the variables. But again, once you understand that the only variable that gets treated like a variable is the one you're trying to solve for, everything else is like a number, it's really not as bad as what it seems. The final thought here is to be sure to read the instructions to determine which variable is the target. If it says solve for m, make sure you understand that m is it. If it says solve for e, you have to make sure you know which letter you're aiming at, otherwise you're going to make the wrong moves. Afterwards, just be careful to be sure to think carefully and don't try to rush through the problem. As long as you know what your target is and as long as you choose wisely, you'll probably do it correctly. Or again, if you're having issues, be sure to bring it up so I can try to guide you in the right direction. The good news is that literal equations is not a topic that's going to cause you to fail a Chapter 2 test, but you still need to know it because, again, you do have a quiz coming up with literal equations on it this week. So no pressure, but you do need to learn at least the basic idea of what's going on so you can perform on that when it counts. Good luck.